All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of The Truth About Your Health, where it is our mission to empower 100 million people to go from exhausted to energized. And no more is that evident in getting to the root cause of why you're so exhausted and tired. And this is part 3 with our special guest, Morley Robbins, who is the creator of the Root Cause Protocol, as well as the Magnesium Advocacy Group. He's got his BA in biology at Denison University and holds an MBA at George Washington as well. He was in healthcare administration, but now he spends his life dedicated to research and educating the masses on how we're being hoodwinked on what our energy production revolves around, and almost everything we do and are taught, in terms of his words, being misled and misfed, get us further from the truth than closer. So Morley, thank you so much for being here yet again for part 3.
Thank you so much. I really am enjoying this ongoing dialogue, and I'm sure it's going to lead even more discussion as we progress.
So and again, I'm proud of my war-torn book here, the Cure, Cure Your Fatigue, how balancing 3 minerals and 1 protein is the solution that you're looking for. This is how you had already been on my radar before that, but through my research and all the exhausted and burnt out people that I work with, just continuing going down those rabbit holes and understanding that the energy production problem is the #1 problem, whether you think you have fibromyalgia, or in the case that we work with, adrenal fatigue or HPA axis dysfunction. At the end of the day, you're not producing energy at the level that you need to. And just to recap what we've talked about so far, we've talked about the categories in your book, the why you're so tired, being misled and misfed information, how modern day healthcare is anything but, how we are being basically, I guess, removed from the truth of how your body actually makes energy, because that's not being taught in medical school or healthcare schools at all. Also, what the result of that is in terms of oxidation, and then ultimately, what do we do about it? And one of the most exciting things that we talked about last time was stress and fatigue and the relationship between that and energy. And then ultimately we ended with the stops and the things that we need to do to stop decreasing the availability of the most important nutrient, bioavailable copper, so that our cells will breathe effectively. And it's an either or. You're either using oxygen effectively to produce ATP, or you're producing exhaust. And if you're not making an income, you're creating an expense. And it's even worse to create an expense when you don't have an income. So here we are, and I wanted to get into the starts of what people should do. We'll definitely have the links posted so that they can get access to the first 2 interviews. But I think it's a good place to springboard from, Morley, in terms of the starts. But of course, if you want to just catch us up with any thoughts that come to your head before we do that, then by all means, let's get started.
No, absolutely. What I enjoy, Joel, is you probably are my twin in terms of being able to come up with analogies that people understand. Income versus expense. That's really what it's about. The other one that I've used over the years is, we've all at some point have either done this personally or we've witnessed it, someone trying to balance on a boogie board where there's a ball in the middle and you got to keep your body in balance. And anyone who's done that knows the energy that's required in the legs to maintain that balance. Well, that's what this is all about. When we want to have metabolic homeostasis, stay in balance, you got to be producing lots of energy. When we don't have the energy, when we start to fatigue on that boogie board, what happens? We're going to go to one side or the other. And that's where most people find themselves when they're in a state of exhaustion, whether we can use the phrase adrenal exhaustion or fatigue or chronic myalgia, whatever the fibromyalgia, whatever the right phrase is, there is a loss of cellular energy, and it's on a scale that it's affecting our ability to stay in balance. So it's important for people to realize why this energy is so important. And again, the phrase that I'm using of late is ignore the enemies, ignite the energy. And it's not to be naive that there aren't enemies out there. We know there are, but the body is amazingly designed. Once it has the capacity, the natural capacity to make energy, the pathogens go away. They disappear. They are annihilated, or they go back into their dormant state. And it's just it's a fact of physiology that's how it works. And so the intention of the root cause protocol is to restore energy at a macro level, and at a micro level, restore the bioavailability of copper. And there are a series of steps that we go through. And one of the most important is we went through many of the stops in our last discussion. And I think it's good for people to know that there are some critical roadblocks to allowing the body to restore its energy. One of the big roadblocks is being allergic to your environment. There are people that are reacting to their foods, they're reacting to mold, they're reacting to whatever the factor might be in their general environment. And that reaction is a histamine response, mast cell activation disorder, whatever the right phraseology is. And histamines are a very powerful hormone, as you well know. They are the hormone of alert, letting the body know we have a crisis. You were talking about the stuff outside the cell and the stuff inside the cell. Well, what does histamines do? It ejects potassium and magnesium out of the intracellular space, and it floods the cell with calcium and sodium and water to try to flush out whatever the problem was. And in the short term, that's a good thing. But if it's being done on a chronic basis, as you know, it's a very bad thing. So we encourage people to do techniques like NAET to begin to turn off that error message. It's basically what it is. That they're, what I've learned over the years, more by inference than by information, but when I'm dealing with someone who is highly sensitive to their environment, they've got this much copper and they've got this much iron. It's just they're out of control with iron, and iron really destabilizes the capacity to stay in balance. So controlling the histamine response is very, very important. And what people need to know is that the master antioxidant protein, it's not glutathione. Everyone loves to talk about how important glutathione is. It's important, but the master antioxidant protein is ceruloplasmin. It expresses about 20 different ways in the body, but one of the most important is that in the presence of histamine, there's a fourfold rise of the expression of histaminase. We know it as diamine oxidase, but histaminase back in the late 1940s was the enzyme that broke down histamines. So what is that saying? Well, if you're copper deficient, if you have low bioavailable copper, you will be more vulnerable to the histamine response because you cannot mobilize the histaminase enzyme to neutralize it. It's a big deal. It's a huge deal. So overreactivity to the environment is number one. Number two, too much iron. And I think part of the challenge in the modern era is to get past the narrative of you're anemic and you're copper toxic. It's you refer to it as the paradox. The paradox is it's the inverse of what we're being told it is. And most people they may present with low iron in the blood, but it's stuck in the tissue because it's not going to get properly recycled. And I know we're going to talk about that in a little bit. So the ability to recycle that iron it's paramount. And one of the things that we encourage people to do is to do blood donations on a regular basis. If you're a guy and a postmenopausal woman, you can do a blood donation probably every quarter. If you're a cycling woman, still with your menstrual cycle, probably 2 or 3 times a year is still advisable. And because that, excuse me, that that loss of blood is a tonic. It forces the body, mobilizes the body to replace all those red blood cells, which is a very important process to reignite in the body, because most people have never given blood in their lifetime, which is kind of a scary thing, but it is what it is. And then there's a third phenomenon that's probably, it might be more significant than anything else. And that's the notion that whenever we have unresolved emotional issues, they're going to become fear inside our psyche. And fear is a very powerful emotion, as I think everyone can attest to. But there's important research that's been done around the emotion of fear and the fact that it creates hypoxia, which is not a good thing on a metabolic level. And very important study done by Zamin-Pira, Zaminpira, 2018, looks at how this fear creates hypoxia in cells and cancer in humans. And what's important for people to understand is that the emotion of fear triggers two hormones, adrenaline and cortisol. Well, adrenaline, fuel injector, but has a very powerful relationship with iron. And what you don't want to do is mix adrenaline and iron, because that's going to create adrenochrome, and that's the fuel for schizophrenia. And cortisol triggers a 4 to 5-fold increase in metallothionein protein. And what's metallothionein do? It binds up copper 1,000 times stronger than it binds up zinc. So effectively what you're doing when you're in a state of fear, acute fear is one thing, chronic fear, and again, we're 18 months, almost 2 years now into a chronic state of fear. And that has a profound effect on our copper status, our bioavailable copper status, and ultimately our ability to make energy. So those are some really powerful roadblocks to get in the way. The fourth that we're beginning to dip our toe into, and I do it with some degree of trepidation, but I think it's a very profound state that we find ourselves in, where we know there are multiple pathogens out there. And we have a real understanding of bacteria and yeast and viruses. We seem to be really fuzzy about parasites. And it's not taught in medical school. I have a friend who undergrad at the Naval Academy, went to nuclear sub school, and then as he decided he wanted to be a doctor, and he said medical school was a joke compared to nuclear sub school, but he said that because he was going to be stationed overseas, he specifically took a course in parasitology, which none of his classmates took. And he said he thinks it's one of the glaring weaknesses of conventional training, that these parasites are wicked. I think we're learning that. We don't need to dwell on that. But what we're realizing is that parasites are really good at living on iron and destabilizing copper status. And what I was shocked to learn last year by reading a patent application, and patent applications are based on, it's basically a deposition. It's a legal document that you're transmitting information that has the basis of law, if you will. And this was a particular patent for a drug to deal with multiple sclerosis. And in the patent application, it said it would be good for the reader to know that autoimmune disease is a byproduct of parasites affecting the immune system. Well, that was the light bulb moment, because suddenly a lot of things began to make more sense then. And so, there are over 100 different expressions of autoimmune now. So again, it's sort of an uncomfortable merger of two ideas, energy and enemies, right? But what we're realizing is that that these parasites are easily overlooked. And the typical response is to go after them via gut detox programs. Well, parasites are all over the body, and they're there for a reason. And so we have to address them with frequency, not necessarily with chemicals. So we've identified these four cornerstones of roadblocks, if you will, because what we need to do ultimately is remove as much of the noise, the chronic stress that we have in our lives, so that when we start to focus on the starts, the body can begin to get its mojo back. And, again, it's important for people to refresh their understanding of the stops, because most of those are dissing mainstream recommendations, especially in the current era. But the starts are really designed to restore copper and to restore the bioavailability of copper and begin to inject more mineral balance, if you will. And so we put particular emphasis on things like bee pollen and real vitamin C, as opposed to ascorbic acid. They're very different. Real vitamin C is an antioxidant. It's a complex, has 6 moving parts. Look, ascorbic acid is a pro-oxidant, and it's in the literature. It's a very hotly debated point, but the fact of the matter is, a real vitamin C has an engine at its core called tyrosinase. Now, what will be a very educational moment for your listeners is to look up in food journals all of the tyrosinase inhibitors. Wink, wink, get it? We don't want the food to spoil. What are they really doing? They're introducing tyrosinase inhibitors in our body through the food, and people don't realize how critical darkness is to the function of the human body. Melatonin, which is produced in every mitochondria, it's the chemical expression of darkness, and it's a very powerful antioxidant. And the role that melanin plays in restoring and maintaining our energetic balance is profound. There's even a theory out of Mexico that melanin encapsulates the mitochondria, and it's the work of Solis Herrera, amazing sun man, Solis Herrera. But it's phenomenal work about we really do have a blind spot around tyrosinase. If it's doing way more than just hair color, eye color, and skin color. And it's just there. It turns out there are dots on our skeleton, and on a chimpanzee there are 11 dots, and on a human spinal cord there are 12 dots. That's fascinating to know. But those dots have metabolic purpose in our physiology. And so it's important to understand that vitamin C, real vitamin C, profoundly important. And in an era where mineral content of the soil is subject to question, we really do need to turn to supplements to make sure we're getting our requisite amount of tyrosinase. And then we have focus on beef liver as a prime source of many nutrients, not the least of which is a healthy cow eating properly nourished grass is going to have twice as much copper as it has iron. We've been raised to believe that the liver is an iron organ, when in fact the liver was really designed to store 2 nutrients, retinol, vitamin A, and copper. The hepatocytes live for retinol and copper. And that's the seat of where the bulk of ceruloplasmin is produced, in the hepatocytes of the liver. So beef liver, and there are other obviously other animals that we can use, but there's a difference in the concentrations. Not all liver is the same. There's dramatic differences between beef liver, bison liver, sheep liver, I don't know, elk liver. You just need to look it up in a nutrient profile. And what you really want is you're looking for a bolus of copper, bioavailable copper. And what's a very rich source of retinol in our diet? It's liver. What you want to stay away from is polar bear liver. It'll knock you over, and you probably go into a coma because of the amount of nutrients in polar bear liver. But the thing is, there are these nutrient-dense sources of food out there, and so we put priority emphasis on those. We put tremendous emphasis on the importance of minerals in general, particularly as it relates to making sure you're eating foods that have been properly raised in mineral-rich soil, but mineralize the water that you're drinking, and make sure that you're not afraid to put salt, proper salt on your food, because that's what our ancestors did. What does the word salad actually mean? It means salt. What makes the salad really special is to sprinkle it with salt. It's what brings it to life. And we have been horribly, as you've noted, misled and misfed, because we've been told that, oh, sodium is bad. It was never the sodium was the problem. They took potassium out of the picture. What's hypertension? It's too little potassium. You don't have potassium in your system. There's all sorts of miscommunications. And I think it's worth noting for the listener, what's one of the most effective ways to cause renal potassium wasting? Take vitamin D supplements. Dr. John Ferris, noted professor of medicine at Yale Medical School in 1962, wrote an article to that effect. Nobody knows about it, but as soon as you lower potassium in the cell, again, back to inside, outside, when you lower potassium in the cell, guess who comes flooding in? Iron. And that's not something you want to get excited about, but it has a profound effect. And there are multiple studies that look at that very dynamic. So there is tremendous emphasis placed on making sure that we are restoring mineral status. One of the more popular ways is what we call adrenal cocktails. It's a very simple concoction. I came upon it by a nurse who became a naturopath. Her name was Susan Blackert. She was outside of the St. Louis area. And it's, take 4 ounces of fresh squeezed orange juice, take a 1/4 teaspoon of sea salt, 1/4 teaspoon of, she at the time was using cream of tartar, but your preferred form of potassium, and drink it mid-morning, mid-afternoon. Why mid-morning, mid-afternoon? Because those are the classic adrenal drop times. Who did the original research of that? About when did the adrenals get weakest? Oh, it was Dr. Pepper. If you remember, the logo for Dr. Pepper was a clock face, 10-2-4. I don't know whether Joel, you may be too young to remember that.
All right.
But I grew up with that. And I mean, the Dr. Pepper of today is very different than what I grew up with, I can tell you that. But the point is, they knew through the research that the adrenal function sagged around 10 o'clock when we go for coffee, and between 2 and 4 o'clock when we have another coffee break. And it's like we've just been conditioned that, yeah, I need a jolt of caffeine, when in fact the body's supposed to be restoring its own energy production. And how does it do that? Well, you better have that. You've got to have bioavailable copper. And I think one of the best explanations for adrenal fatigue comes by way of Tom Callan, noted Bay Area physician. I think he's now retired, but he calls adrenal fatigue fat deficiency syndrome. And it's absolutely genius. And what's the fat? It's retinol. And where's 95% of the real vitamin C stored in the human body? In the adrenal glands. The adrenal is on top of the renal glands. And you got to have retinol, you got to have that copper, and that's when the magic happens inside the adrenal glands to produce the 50 hormones that they're supposed to be synthesizing day in and day out. What I find absolutely entertaining is this little butterfly here. I like to call it the thyroid. It makes one hormone, right? and all the electron microscopes and telescopes are all focused on the thyroid. And what are we taught? The adrenal glands, that they don't matter. That's all hocus pocus. 50 hormones? Come on, folks. Let's put and I think you understand that. That's why you put such a priority emphasis on it. But again, it's another case of paradox. The focus is here when in fact your focus is where it belongs, back on the adrenal. And so we put particular emphasis on things like boron. Boron helps to regulate iron. Boron has a very powerful relationship with oxygen, and it seems to stem the creation of oxidative stress, which is very, very important. But we also use things like diatomaceous earth and rice bran. Rice bran is just a very rich source of B vitamins, and as is the liver that we talk about. The diatomaceous earth is just a very low-tech way of dealing with pathogens, parasites especially. Doesn't taste great, but it's very effective at what it does. And then we also, towards the end of the process, we introduce iodine. And it's not that we don't understand what iodine does, but here's a part that people may not know. One of the most important properties of copper is the enzyme called ferroxidase. And what that enzyme does is one of the oldest enzymes on the planet. It turns ferrous iron plus 2 valence into ferric iron plus 3 valence, so that the iron can be properly loaded onto either transferrin or can be properly stored in the ferritin protein. Very, very important function. So ferroxidase, the classification is called multi-copper oxidases. Again, these are ancient enzymes, go back to the beginning of oxygen on the planet. Allegedly, there are over 1,000 different expressions of multi-copper oxidases in our gut. Let your mind get around that thought. And the key is being able to turn ferrous into ferric iron. Very, very important for proper iron regulation. and when that happens, water is given off when copper is the mineral running that enzyme. Really important. Water's a good thing. We know that. Well, it turns out that iodine has very similar properties. Iodine can also convert ferrous iron into ferric iron. But there's a catch. There's no water given. So why is iodine so popular? Because it deals with the culprit, the true culprit of all of our unrest is dysregulated iron. And unlike ferroxidase, which has this natural capacity to recycle itself, iodine, you got to reload it every day. And Big Pharma loves that. And so the practitioners who are pushing iodine are doing it for the right reasons, but they don't understand what the implications are. And I think there's undue emphasis on the thyroid, because the thyroid does not run the body. And maybe that's a discussion we can have another day. But that is, again, another paradox, as you say. And it's meant to confuse the heck out of us, and it does. So it's just, there's a lot of mythology behind the steps that people take to get healthy, and they don't understand the true physiology of it. And I'm only beginning to understand it. I think you certainly are a student of this as well. And we're really trying to make sense out of this very chaotic series of instructions we've been given. Do this, do that. But now we're beginning to understand the physiology of it and the metabolism of it and the energetics of it. And what we've been told in the conventional world makes no sense in the world of energy. And so that's really where I put the priority emphasis. So that gives people at least an initial overview.
I have some notes here. I don't know if I'll be able to get all to them because there's so many great things that you just said there, Morley. The first thing though is originally what you talked about in terms of having the energy to run your body. I think a lot of people don't understand, well, I don't really have an energy problem. They think at the macro level, they think, well, I may not have the energy to run a marathon, but it's not that I don't think energy, for those that have the shades of gray problems of not having cellular respiration, they don't understand the importance of cellular energy. And we talked about before we got started today was the ability just to be able to have those cells respond and get nutrients like a histamine reaction, flush out the tissues and be able to depolarize the cell and be able to get information to and from the cells so that your systems run properly ultimately. So that's what we're talking about, energy. The analogy also I like, what I've heard is the metabolic reserve. And that's where the adrenals come in terms of maintaining homeostasis and even like the new term hormesis and giving it different stressors, and allostasis is the ability to bounce back. And ultimately the analogy is you're in a canoe and paddling up a stream that you're going upstream with, and you're working hard to maintain or go forward, but there's the metabolic drift where ultimately you fall behind and you're working a lot harder just to catch up, let alone fall over the waterfall. That's really what the energetic problem is in the cells per se. The other thing I wanted to mention was just as far as the autoimmune, it's really interesting too with the parasites. I've heard it be in terms of the autoimmunity first starts with nutritional deficiencies. And that would kind of go along the lines of if you're not breathing effectively and you're oxidizing, then you're depleting yourself of your minerals and you become mineral imbalanced, and then you more susceptible to evils as you've mentioned it. So yeah, a lot of interesting things there. The thing I wanted to talk about too with you is the fact of the energetics of getting nutrients into and out of the cell. I think that's really important. But before we go there, we had talked about the recycling of iron. And so I think that's important for people to understand, because I know that's going to take a little more information. And if we get back to I think we did talk a lot about just making sure that we have proper energy to run the system. So as far as the recycling of iron. So as you mentioned in the book, ideally we're intaking 1 milligram of iron per day. 95%, maybe you can correct me, 95% of the iron that we have in our body is recycled. So I tell people, think of it as like an assembly line where you eat food and there's iron going to be in the food. And as you wrote down so eloquently in your book, it's not that we don't absorb iron. We actually overabsorb iron, or we keep iron stuck in our enterocytes. And when people say, well, I'm iron deficiency or I have iron anemia, I don't absorb iron, they need to understand you don't get iron into your bloodstream if that's what you mean by absorb, because enterocytes in the intestinal area is not getting iron out of those places. But either way, you get iron, it gets absorbed. Ideally, if everything's working, all things being equal, it gets exported or transported in the tissues and into the blood. It goes into the cell, it gets used. And then like our environment today, we want to recycle the parts that we don't use, or the parts that we use but are inorganic, or they're metals, right? And they need to be able to be reused again. And so, that's why we have this recycling system. And anywhere along that assembly line that doesn't work effectively is going to create stress in the body, or oxygenation that is going to mix with free radicals, and instead of making energy, it's going to create exhaust. So why don't you explain, because I would like a little more deeper understanding myself as well as the listeners, as what goes wrong with the recycling of iron and how copper plays a role in all of that.
And we have a couple days to
What's that?
we have a couple days to talk about this.
Yeah, right. Sorry. Yeah.
But It's very, very important issue. And I think what you picked up on, which I want to emphasize, is the process of iron absorption, two-step process. The first step is getting the iron into the enterocyte. Again, pretend this is an enterocyte. This is the villi, and this is the body of the cell. And the bloodstream is down here. And so the iron has got to get from the villi into the body of the cell, but then it's got to get out of the cell, out of the enterocyte, into the bloodstream. So that requires some degree of sophistication. And turns out it's really easy to get iron into the enterocyte, easy peasy. And there's all sorts of reductase enzymes to make sure that, again, that the iron that's in our food system is, there actually are five doorways for iron to get into the enterocyte. That's a good thing to know. Like the body's like, come on in, come on in, come on in. Getting it out, not as easy. And so the key is that there's a front door and there's a back door. There are lots of front doors. You can see all these different front doors. The back door is called ferroportin, iron doorway, ferroportin doorway, and it is run by a copper doorman. And if an enzyme, and it's a ferroxidase enzyme, and it's called hephaestin. So what you have in the human body are three different expressions of ferroxidase. We have ceruloplasmin, which is in our blood and in our tissue, but for the most part, it's in the blood. We have hephaestin. It's a play on the Greek mythology about the furnace. But hephaestin, very important expression of ferroxidase, particularly in the enterocytes. It's in our eyes, it's in other tissue, but for the most part, it's in the gut. And there's a third expression called cyclopen, Cyclops. Again, the hematologists seem to have a real sense of humor with Greek mythology. But cyclopen shows up in the placenta of the pregnant woman. And what's worth noting is that a pregnant woman actually expresses all three: ceruloplasmin, hephaestin, and cyclopen. And guess what birthing practitioners never measure? Copper status. Interesting. So the hephaestin is vitally important to make sure that the iron that's in the enterocyte can be turned into a +3 form, because what happens is when it's coming into the enterocyte, it doesn't matter what form it is, it's going to be +2 inside the body of the cell. And then in order to get it out of the cell, it's got to be turned back into a +3, into a ferric form. Now, if you or I were designing a body, we probably wouldn't do that. But for some reason, there's this valence change when you're going through membranes, and copper is essential for those valence changes. But the iron that gets into the enterocyte, gets into our gut, in order to be properly absorbed, needs to get into the bloodstream. And the critical factor is ferric iron gets attached to transferrin, transports iron, transferrin. And that iron is going to go one of two places. It's either going to go to the bone marrow, where new red blood cells are made, or it's going to go to the liver. It doesn't go to 78 places. And in fact, the part of our anatomy that has the highest avidity or attraction for iron is our bone marrow. Absolute off the chart need for iron to maintain the production of red blood cells, as we've discussed. And so the hephaestin, the expression of ferroxidase, does three things. It changes the valence, it accelerates the movement of iron through that doorway, and it secures its attachment to transferrin. Those are three very powerful things that need to happen. And so the iron then goes to transferrin, and then at some point, that iron is going to get incorporated into red blood cells. And as we've noted in earlier conversations, every second of every day, we make more than 2 million red blood cells, which is a mind-blowing number. And the 5%, 95% is that 5% of the iron we need for that recycling program, 1 milligram, comes from our diet. 95% of the iron needed for that recycling program comes from, or the iron we need for the building of red blood cells comes from a recycling program. But we're really only talking about a small amount of iron, but 95% of it is from a recycling program. And so let's drill in a little deeper. And so the formal name of the system is called reticuloendothelial system, RES. And it's a really scary term, reticuloendothelial. It took me almost 2 years to figure out that meant recycling. It's like, wow, okay. So why is this such a big deal? And here's one of the great unknowns of human physiology, Joel. You'll get a kick out of this. We know that in the red blood cell, it's basically a waiter carrying oxygen. That's where the oxygen molecules go. When we breathe in, there's this rich supply of hemoglobin there, and they're offloading carbon dioxide and they're onloading oxygen, and thank God they do. And then they start to get circulated around the body. And where are they going? They're going to all the cells that need oxygen in order to make energy. And it's just, your mind boggles at the amount of RBC traffic that must be taking place around the tissue. But this is the great unknown. We've got these red blood cells carrying oxygen. They can't make energy aerobically. They're carrying oxygen, but they can't use it. So they make energy anaerobically. What gives the red blood cell its flexibility, and the technical term is deformability. Deformability, why didn't you just say flexible? No, they call it deformability. And so that's what allows it to squeeze into the little capillary spaces. And what allows it to have that deformability is energy production. And it's an anaerobic glycolysis that has 10 enzymes. How many of them require magnesium? 8. Wow, that's a lot of enzyme activity. And that's why the magnesium inside the red blood cell is so important. It's a clue about how resilient, how energetic are these red blood cells. Because the more resilient and energetic they are, the longer they're going to live. They're supposed to live 120 days. If they don't have proper stores of magnesium and copper at their disposal, the life cycle drops to 20 days. There's a big difference between 120 days and 20 days. And so in a state of copper deficiency and magnesium deficiency, we go back to Lucy and Ethel at the chocolate factory when the manager walks in and says, "Speed it up, boys." When you have a very significant change in life cycle, you're suddenly stuffing stuff all over your body, right? And that's what happens when the red blood cell only has a 20-day cycle. The pace, it's a 6-fold increase in activity. So energy production for the red blood cell is very, very important. And it turns out that one of the most important things, the process of going from a stem cell to a fully mature red blood cell takes about 2 days. And there are about 6 or 7 stages. I think it's 7 stages in between. But stage 5 is when the erythroid cell, which is a precursor to a red blood cell, but the erythroid cell needs to offload the nucleus, offload the mitochondria, and offload excess iron. There's too much. As the cell is maturing, it realizes, I got too much iron. I've got to unload it. And if it can't unload that iron, it doesn't become hemoglobin, which then doesn't allow it to become a red blood cell. So the inability to let the iron out through that ferroportin doorway becomes really important, especially in the production of red blood cells. Again, over 2 million a second. Think about that. Playing in the background as we're listening, as we're having this conversation, be thinking about trying to keep track of 2 million cells, trying to offload all this activity. It's crazy. But that's why Carl Sagan got into this expression, billions and billions. It's like we can't even comprehend what's going on. So then we're back to the most mysterious part of human metabolism. We know that the mitochondria, again, 40 quadrillion, average cell 500, huge diversity in terms of going from a liver cell to a brain cell in terms of how many mitochondria there are. And the mitochondria need to turn oxygen into water. And that process of turning O2 into 2 molecules of H2O requires pH of 7. And when that pH is right, 3 energy precursor cells, 3 ADP, go over to complex 5 to become 3 magnesium ATP. And that's the currency that runs the cell. The unknown, I think you're going to find this fascinating. Nobody knows how oxygen gets from outside the cell to the mitochondria. There's no literature on it. The closest you're going to come is Widdowson and Widdowson. Widdowson, I think is the last name. 2007, and they had a theory, but no one's been able to substantiate it. We don't know how oxygen gets from outside the cell into. Is it active transport? Is it just gaseous diffusion? And the reason why I put emphasis on this is we're talking about the second most reactive element on the planet. This is not some benign Play-Doh we're talking about. This is oxygen that is highly reactive. And nobody knows how it gets to the mitochondria? Really? I find that fascinating. And so the process of turning that oxygen into water, as we get into the electron transport chain, very important movement of electrons through the different complexes. You got to have the reducing factors, NAD plus and FADH2, and these are very important. NADH, not NADH plus, NADH, but you've got to have these reducing factors in order to support the movement of electrons. And you've got to have the shuttle carriers, you've got to have coenzyme Q, and you've got to have cytochrome C. Well, it turns out that the cytochrome BC complex, which hangs out at complex 3, relies on ubiquinol to receive it. Cytochrome C at complex 4, guess what it requires? What it relies on? Retinol. Turns out retinol is an electron carrier. That's buried in the research. It's amazing. So when you start to take retinol out of your diet, you're going to start to create a more reactive electron transport chain. Well, that's a good thing to know. And what does glucose do? Again, we seem to have a choice in our diet between sugar and fat, right? And they want us more sugar, less fat. They don't want us eating as much fat. Well, if you have more sugar, it slows down the electrons. Does that sound like a good idea, Joel? To slow down electrons in the electron transport chain? Do you think you're going to create more static? Think you're going to create more oxidative stress? Of course you are. And so that dynamic is taking place. And somewhere in this process, and I really beg of you to be forgiving, because nobody talks about this, but the process of getting oxygen to the mitochondria, we're assuming that iron is still carrying the oxygen, and that iron, after it's dropped off its payload, and what is it? What form is it in? It's in a +2 form to carry oxygen. So when it's in transferrin, when it's in ferritin, it's +3. But when it's the waiter, which is 70% of the iron in your body is a waiter, when it's the waiter, it's +2. And And it needs to be recycled into two very important metabolites. You got to be able to make heme, the heme protein, and you've got to be able to make iron sulfur clusters. And they come in different varieties. There's, 2 irons, 3 irons, 4 irons. It just depends on what part of the electron transport chain you're trying to make. But the key is the mechanisms, the beginning of the heme process begins and ends with copper. ALAS enzyme and ferrochelatase enzyme are absolutely copper dependent. And what's useful for people to know is that the first and the last 3 enzymes to make heme are taking place inside the matrix of the mitochondria. Well, what's hanging out in the matrix? It's 50,000 atoms of copper. I think copper might be really involved in all aspects of that. So you've got 4 that are taking place outside of the mitochondria, but the 4 that are taking place inside the mitochondria are actually hanging out in the matrix. So it really begins to suggest the pivotal role that copper plays in this heme process, and especially the last step, complex, or the enzyme 8 in making heme is called ferrochelatase. And ferrochelatase is a crane that picks up iron and then drops it into the center of the heme molecule so it can go back out and get recycled, so it can go to be made into more hemoglobin, to be made into more red blood cells. Very, very important process. And then the process to make iron sulfur clusters, well, there's a rate limiting variable. And it's called glutaredoxin 5, GRX5. Well, put on your thinking cap. You know who the battery is. It's copper. And so you can't make that pivotal enzyme work if it doesn't have copper, and then that disrupts the production of iron sulfur clusters. And so this recycling process there's this constant process of the delivery of oxygen that's attached to iron, although no one can explain it in detail to my satisfaction. And that iron doesn't just hang out, it needs to be recycled and put into a form that can be reused. Why? Because if it can't be reused, guess what happens? If copper's missing, the oxygen can't be activated properly. Iron's hanging out, isn't being recycled, and then they come together as rust. And it's the most basic disruption of mitochondrial activity is the inability to recycle iron and recycle oxygen into water. And many scientists make the statement that the terminal destination for iron and oxygen is the mitochondria. And that's exactly what they're talking about. And that iron needs to be recycled, turned into heme and iron sulfur clusters, and the oxygen needs to be recycled into water. I don't know where it goes, but the mitochondria are water wheels. And if you're not making water, it becomes a Ferris wheel, and then the Ferris wheel starts to create rust all over the body. So that hopefully gives you a better sense of what the dynamics are and why the iron recycling is so important.
Yeah, it's funny. It's I appreciate all the synapses that fired in your brain over the years to get that out today, because there's a lot of insight in that for sure. It's funny that you use that analogy, because when I'm going over someone's organic acid test results and they show you the Krebs cycle, I tell them, think of it as a water wheel. Think of it as like you're on the casino boat, and if the water doesn't make a full revolution around, it's going to spill out, and that's what we're seeing. And the cofactors are missing, and ultimately, so what's interesting, a couple of things that come to my mind is, as you know, with the genetics, and we talked about that beforehand, at the end of the day, if your cells are not breathing effectively, if you're not making an income and you're creating an expense, you could know all the 7 standard deviation of genetic challenges that happen. You still need to get the body to breathe effectively. and the intelligence of the body, once it has a surplus, it knows what to do with it and get out of the way. Where I argue, well, let's also, now that it knows what to do intelligently, let's accelerate that. But aside from that, the thing that I think about, because I do a lot of training in the functional genomics, and as we talked about, Dr. Bob Miller, and he did a study, a Lyme study. I don't know if you're aware of this, and he found out that those that had the more susceptibility with ferropotent or HMOX, which is recycling, HFE enzymes, that had much more profound challenges, symptoms, problems, expressions when they had the Lyme problem. And now it makes me think of going back and looking at the copper, taking it one step upstream and looking at the copper relationship, and even siphoning out how much more important the expression of illness would be, not because, well, obviously because you're not exporting iron as effectively, even if it is copper available or dependent. But the fact is, it's very seldomly the amount of copper is not there for those enzymes to work effectively. So that's one of the things I think about. The other thing I think about too, Morley, is that I didn't realize, as ferropotent is the only exporter in the body, I was only thinking about enterocytes. I wasn't thinking along the lines of making red blood cells, right? So that's like, boom, like, oh my gosh, that's huge.
It's not just red blood cells, but it's neurons, it's astrocytes,
It's like everything. It's everything. Yeah.
What is every cell doing? Every cell is making energy. If you can't make energy, again, to me, I'm absolutely baffled that no one has, and it's either an oversight on science's part, which I find hard to believe, but no one has been able to document what happens to iron and oxygen after the payload of oxygen is made at the mitochondria. Well, what the heck's going on here, folks? I mean, it's just, to me, it's the most glaring gap in our understanding of physiology. And then you're talking about the iron copper dynamics. You probably have friends who have an older brother. And maybe when you were growing up, you probably witnessed the older brothers beating up on the younger brothers. I've got vivid memories of that. And so think of the younger brother as copper, older brother's iron, right? And Jamie Collins at University of Florida in Gainesville done some amazing work to demonstrate that excess dietary iron crashes copper metabolism. And he's looking at a macro level and also at a cellular level. And it's so obvious. And what's the backbone of our immune system was energy, but a critical factor is interleukin-2. Well, interleukin-2 is copper dependent. Both the innate and acquired immune systems run on the energy of copper, but they also are critically dependent on copper. And who's talking about that? Besides you and me, I don't know a lot of people talking about it. And so it's just, people have this very corralled perspective of how the body runs. What's a narrative? It's not nature. Nature's over here relying on minerals and energy and incredible signaling mechanisms. And we're supposed to believe that pathogens rule all, and come on, it's so much more dynamic than that. And I think it's really important for people. Again, I think we've used this phrase, but you need to ask better questions and demand better answers, because we're not in kindergarten anymore. We're at a very critical juncture, and I think we need to be very discerning about the quality of the information that we're basing our decisions on. Right? And I think that's the importance of this exchange that we're having, is people are getting an injection of truth that they've probably have never heard before, at least in the sense of the intensity of this kind of conversation.
Yeah, it's interesting too. The other thing I thought about when you're getting into the recycling, and even before that, was just the concept of frequency, and you talked about melanin, and we talked about circadian rhythm, or times of the day where we have the dip, and all cells work on a circadian rhythm, and they're ultimately synchronizing with each other to work as a system. And it's all about communication, and how copper really allows the mitochondria and the I guess the computer chip to be able to have the information to communicate. And I also think about the fact that with the frequency of just the earth, right? I mean, you think about we're minerals. I mean, I remember, like, as I'm trained as a chiropractor, I used to do training, and remember thinking about the innate intelligence. Like, what's the difference, God forbid, if you got struck by lightning and you were dead, or you were standing up? The difference is that energy in the body, that frequency, that energy that's there. And really, I've told people, if you could go in a time machine and go back 200 years, where the minerals were plentiful in the earth, where we didn't have Wi-Fi and social media, and we were able to maybe even the light bulb, and be able to go to bed when it gets dark out, or go camping and get synchronized with the earth, and have that frequency of the soils and the nutrients to really harmonize your cells. That's probably the best medicine that you could ever do, right, Morley? In terms of just get out of the way, no matter how complicated you just described what you described and what we've been talking about. It really is simple in terms of get the body what it needs, remove what it doesn't need, and let the magic happen on its own. It's easier said than done, but ultimately it's getting the proper frequencies of the earth, getting the body communicating with the earth. That's what grounding is, and electrons and so forth. Making sure that you're getting rid of the static electricity, if you will, and then being able to build up the reserves so that you're not only paying interest payments, if you will, and you keep falling further and further behind on the metabolic drift, and you're getting closer to that waterfall. And you don't even have to think about it. You're just doing it naturally. It's quite amazing. As I always say, Morley, as bad as it is now, I do feel it because I'm from Canada, and I was like, people used to make fun of me when I went and moved to the US, because there was the whole sort of, I think Canada has a little bit of an inferiority complex, but there's a certain amount of, hey, like, it's obnoxious, and you go there. And I say, you know what, at the end of the day, it's the best of the best and the worst of the worst. And I do feel like that's where we are in healthcare, and where we are in the world. And the information you bring forward is we're the best of the best and the worst of the worst. And we know so much more than we ever have known. And the body is incredibly resilient when you get out of the way and you allow it to do what it needs to do. Lots of amazing things that you talked about. As far as I'm sure we could do a part 4, as far as any loose ends that you want to add to that. I mean, I know just when you were talking about about the recycling of iron, and I know a lot of people talk about like cryptopyrroles and having that problem. At the end of the day, I think about it's the copper issue. That's a huge thing. And the other thing that was really enlightening when you told me is just that RBC magnesium, and how deformable a red blood cell is for it to actually get into the tissues to make ATP, and why it's so important to have that magnesium. Any other sort of things that you want to bring up that kind of comes up in your head with all the things that I just mentioned?
Yeah, no, I think it's useful for the listener to step back from this discussion. And again, I give high marks to Joel for having this kind of dialogue. There are not a lot of people where I have this kind of freewheel dive into reality, but I think it's important for the listener to kind of step back and just ponder this idea that there is no such thing as iron deficiency anemia. It makes no sense on a geophysical level, and on a metabolic level, and maybe someday we can get into the real reality of that. But that becomes one of the cornerstones of belief, is that anemia exists, so then I've got to feed iron. It's the worst possible thing you can do is put excess iron into the human body. And then the second issue to really come to terms with is there's no such thing as medical disease. It doesn't exist. There is stress-induced mineral dysregulation that causes metabolic dysfunction. And one phrase for that is adrenal fatigue or hypothyroidism or whatever your favorite term is. But at the end of the day, every condition attached to a symptom, the reason for the title of the book, and hold the book up real quick if you would, Joel, there's method to my madness. It's cure your fatigue. What isn't just adrenal fatigue, we're talking about energy deficiency at the cellular level. And when you realize that there's this deficit in energy that precedes every other breakdown in the body, whether we're talking about 1 standard deviation out to 6 or 7 standard deviations, it becomes the most important understanding that this planet, our life, revolves around energy. What's the famous expression around that? E equals mc squared. Energy equals mass times the speed of light. Well, what does that really mean? Energy is a function, or it gets translated into structure and function. And if the energy changes, the structure and function of the tissue changes. It's an energetic equation. It isn't that, oh, well, there was some demonic bug that got into my body and I lost. No, you lost your energy homeostasis, and that changed the whole physiology of energy dynamics, which then changed the cellular dynamics. And it's important to have that sense of understanding that there really is one mechanism of this dis-ease. That it revolves around energy deficiency. The phrase that I used in the book is fatigue, just so people could grasp it. But I think it's so important for people to realize that is this, it's always playing in the background. And the point that you made earlier, Joe, which is very important, is at a macro level, you may feel just fine. But any symptom that you've got, headache, stiff joints, bowel dysfunction, blurry eyes, whatever it happens to be, liver, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, heart disease, Lyme disease, doesn't matter what the expression is. At the very basis of it is tissue is not able to make adequate energy to stay in harmony, in homeostasis. That's the underlying truth of how our body really works. And it's an important principle to realize that when I do have a symptom, wow, I must be dealing with some stress, and begin to peel back that onion to find out what that stressor is. Is it something dietary? Is it something environmental? Is it some relationship issue, or whatever it happens to be? And begin to understand that there's always a price to pay for the stress in our world out here is going to turn into oxidative stress in our body. And some parts of our body are better equipped to handle that stress than others. And if there's a chronic, perpetual issue in our life, well, the organ that's attached to that emotion, and the Chinese figured this out thousands of years ago, that organ is going to be more minerally challenged because it's been dealing with more stress. And that begins to explain some of the varieties of symptoms that people have within a community or within a family or whatever the unit of abstraction is.
Yeah, it's a paradigm shift of what energy really is for. And ultimately, life is never smooth sailing. And, when we come to a hill and we're in a car, you can't maintain the same speed to necessarily overcome it. You have to put more pressure in the accelerator to overcome that. And that's really the analogy, is when you have a bigger stress in your life, you need to produce energy to bring your body back to normal, or always changing, which is amazing. The thing that I would probably plant the seed for now, Morley, is now that we understand the what we're not being told, and I really like the words misled and misfed. It comes down to that's a priority now, not which I was doing a lot of thinking after we got off the call last time. And it's important to make sure people are educated. And I love the word democratization of healthcare, or democratization of energy, and giving it back to the user. But the deeper purpose of going forward and removing the barriers that don't allow us to understand these things, and being misled, and the fact that we're misfed, and the reasons for that. I think that there's a deeper purpose in educating a community and helping them democratize energy. Has to come through laws being written, and companies being penalized, and so forth and so on. But amazing conversation nonetheless. And you know what, I always ask someone, and I'd be interested for you this as well, even though I'm keeping it open for part 4, 5, and 6, is, you know, one of the things that I ask my guests are, if you would have known now what you would have wished you would have known then, or with the sage like Morley that knows his information that he knows now, with sort of the bright-eyed and bushy-tailed Morley when you were going through life and having some obstacles and so forth, what would you have wished you would have told that more naive or not understanding Morley guy that would have accelerated your learning curve or helped you get over the humps quicker? Or what would have been the most useful piece of information that you wish you would have known then that you know now?
That's a great question. When you're in college and you want to be a doctor, and you're going through a pre-med program, which is very rigorous, and you can imagine, you've gone through a program, you know how just physically and emotionally exhausting it is. But at an undergraduate level, it's pretty demanding. And you get to the end of the process and you come up empty. And you get rejections. And so the natural conclusion is, I wasn't smart enough. And so you start out your adult life thinking that you're not smart enough. And that becomes sort of a handicap, if you will, for going forward. I think what the sage in me now would say, first of all, maybe you would have been a lousy doctor. That would be a good thing to know. But you didn't get low grades because you're not smart. You got low grades because you see the game differently. And you didn't understand, and this was my dilemma. It's like, why do I need to know what the Doppler effect is if I want to be a surgeon? I couldn't connect those dots. It just didn't, and it wasn't just enough to say, well, I mastered the Doppler effect, and therefore I just like, this makes no sense at all. Why am I? And so I think it's what I've learned since that more sensitive period of my life is that I wasn't learning what made sense to me. I wasn't learning the right things. I wasn't studying the right areas. And by a quirk of fate, and I do mean a quirk, the universe said, well, let's see what he does with this mineral thing. And it became oxygen. I was able to breathe, maybe for the first time in my life professionally, to see, wow, I really do understand this, but it was in a language that I understood immediately. And then it was a subject matter that I got excited talking about and wanting to teach people, and then wanting to extend that to reach as many people as I can. I absolutely love your goal of reaching 100 million people. I think that's ambitious and bold, and it's exactly the right number. And the thing is, when we're in our 20s, we're very vulnerable. Now I'm 69 as of a few weeks ago, and I've lived a very full life. Have had amazing experiences. 4 kids who are just off the charts in terms of their talents on many levels, but have had life experiences that I never would have expected to have. But I've been blessed with an opportunity to do my life's work, which is not many people can say that I can honestly. Ralph Waldo Emerson has a famous poem on success. And I love that poem. And one of my favorite parts of that poem is to know that one life has breathed easier. And I think you experience this in your practice as well. You have touched thousands and thousands of lives, and by virtue of your interaction, they're better people for it. And I've been able to experience that and witness that. And when I first met Dr. Liz, I was absolutely mesmerized by the thousands of people she had touched in her chiropractic career, and just the following that she had. And I didn't have any of that. I didn't know, I was so in awe of it. And I never imagined that in my lifetime, I would be able to experience anything that even comes close to it. So I think it's important for people to realize that sometimes if it appears that the door is closing, Sound of Music, there's always a window that's opening. And it may take years and years for that window to open, but to know and believe in yourself that you do have a reason for being here. We all have a purpose in being on this planet. We're here to learn lessons. And I never would have predicted the focus that I have, or the kind of impact that it's having. And it's a very special moment to know that that there's a community, a growing community of people who really get excited about these dots that are being connected, and that people are able to springboard with the work that they do, like you do, and other people who just say, I just want to help people with the RCP or whatever. It doesn't matter what the venue is, but it's these foundational components are making sense, but they're also allowing people to have their life back. And I think that's really a very special moment. And I think, in retrospect, I don't know that I could have understood what that sage person is now saying. When I was in my 20s, I was an insufferable pain in the butt to deal with. And I don't know that I really would have understood it. But now looking back, as you pose the question, it sure would have been nice to try to tap into that and let the younger Turk know that there's different avenues of expression, and go easy on yourself and just find the one that feels right for you. And if the first couple paths don't make sense, then keep trying, because there is a path that we're all meant to follow, but we need to go through sometimes these schools of hard knocks that are very uncomfortable, very painful, but they're very profound in their ability to prepare us for our calling, if you will.
Yeah, it's a great answer. And I think I guess the answer, though, because there's so much you put in there, I guess the answer that I'm inferring is you would have told that younger Morley, it's okay to not worry about the fact that this doesn't interest you. Redefine how you're interpreting it, in terms of, you're not dumb, it's just not in your wheelhouse. And yeah. And but the thing is, that's an important lesson with the people that I teach too, is it's the spin we put on things. And sometimes I feel like the best answers, which you kind of did mention, I don't think I would have been ready for it. And when the student is ready, the teacher will appear, right? And I think a lot of the times we put a lot of energy and negative energy in something that is serving us to get to the next step, to the next step, to the next step, and really be sage like in those when it's unfolding, so that you don't attach a negative energy to it, or at least a stress energy or a hypoxic inducing energy that causes a major problem. And most importantly, what I tell clients is be grateful for that. But be very grateful. Like, if I had not questioned, if I had just had a different personality and I would have just studied that, would I have been a good doctor? Would I have been happy? Would have I had a midlife crisis? And put that gratitude of, I'm so grateful that I figured it out, and I had to go through those trials and tribulations. Like, that's back to the analogy again of having to put your foot on the accelerator, where the only way that you're going to sail in a sailboat is if there is a wind. If there's no wind, you're not going anywhere. Now, if the wind's coming in your face, it's a lot harder, but you could tack back and forth and get to where you want to get to. So I think it's really important to put that gratitude spin on it, and be grateful for it, and embrace, and not just sort of go through the emotion or the saying of I'm grateful, but energetically feeling that gratitude. And so there's lots of wisdom in what you said there, Morley. I really do appreciate our conversations and your insight. And definitely, you know, again, probably, hopefully everyone's that listening to this is listening to the first and the second one, but just always like a good call to action on where they get the reports or where they learn more about the stops and starts. Definitely they can get the book on any place where they get a book service, but where are they getting the information to know more about everything we've talked about today?
Yeah, the main website is the name of the movement, if you will. It's the Root Cause Protocol, RCP. So the website is rcp123.org. There are two social media landing sites. There's the MAG Facebook group has about over 205,000 people now. And we've got a Facebook page. It's all about the RCP. I think there's like 30 or 40,000 there. So it's a mind-blowing set of people. And then again, the book, of course, you go to any platform that you feel comfortable buying from. You're not going to find it in your local bookstore. It's not going to, we're not quite there yet. There is an ebook version as well as a physical, and there will be an audio in the spring. Hopefully by April, that's the goal. And people are always wanting to reach out. They're very welcome to contact me by my email, morleyrobbins@gmail.com. And then my phone is 847-922-8061. The website has information about the protocol, the RCP, stops and starts. It has information about research that we're doing. It has information on the training that we do. The next class, group 15, will start up, I believe it's February 9th, which I think is a Thursday, and it will go for 16 weeks going forward. And a lot of people are really finding that to be an important stepping stone to incorporating these concepts, whether they are a licensed professional like yourself or just a citizen scientist that wants to make a difference in their community. So it's a useful way to incorporate the information. The research has all been kind of compiled so people can learn it in bite-sized pieces. And we're just very excited to have this opportunity to share this information with folks.
Yeah, awesome. Well, listen, again, we'll keep it open for part 4, and definitely learn a lot on my own when you do these talks with me, especially with the recycling of iron. There's some ahas that I always get with that. And definitely at the end of the day, it comes down to taking action with the information. It's not just a feel good, hear it. If you don't apply it, it's like you didn't even hear it. So make sure whatever you do with the information, less is more. Remove the things that deplete your cell's ability to breathe effectively. Do the things that help your cells do that as well, and start to get out of the way and see things happen. So Morley, thank you so much for everything that you do, and look forward to our next conversation.
Likewise. Well, thank you so much.